Good evening, Frederick Douglass Elementary School. It's Mrs. Shupard, and I'm here with another episode of Tucked In Tuesday. We're going to be continuing on with our One Book, One Seaford book, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And tonight we're going to be reading chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10, Harvest Time. The only reason I was hopeful about returning to school was that my father had managed to harvest a small plot of tobacco. He had saved the seeds from the previous year, and back in September I'd nursed the seedlings down at the dambo before transferring them to our fields. Somehow the plants had survived much of the famine and grown fairly healthy. The leaves light brown in color with traces of red. Several weeks earlier, Jeffrey and I had picked the tobacco and hung it to dry under the bamboo shelters. In a normal year, a crop that strong would fetch a high price at the auction in Lilongwe. But now with the hunger, we couldn't be sure of anything. Besides, my father had already started borrowing money and maize in exchange for the tobacco once it was ready, which meant that the minute those leaves were dry, we'd have to start settling our debts. As the first day of school approached, I was getting indication that things were okay. For one, my father had said nothing to me about staying home due to the lack of fees. In fact, one afternoon he had handed me a few kwacha to go buy a notebook and pencils. And my mother had purchased a big bar of Malawa soap, which allowed me to finally scrub the yellow stains from my school shirt. The night before the big day, I carefully ironed my clothes, laid them out on a chair right next to my school supplies so that they were ready for the morning. I was so nervous that I stayed awake for hours trying to imagine every detail: what I would eat for breakfast, what I would look like in my uniform, and how I'd greet Gilbert on the road. I desperately missed my friends and the excitement of a classroom. When Gilbert appeared from the trees the next morning, I ran to meet him. Gilbert, bow, bow, sharp, sharp, fit, fit. Welcome back, friend. It's good to walk with you again. Oh, thank you, Gilbert. It's good to be here. It was great to be back with my pals, all the jokesters and usual entertainers. I saw many familiar faces. We were all still thin, and that wouldn't change until the harvest, but at least our health was improving. But just as I feared, I was behind in everything: geography, agriculture, math, all the subject I'd studied in the library. My fellow students were working on graphs and variables and scientific names of animals. I didn't know any of that stuff. I'd struggled for the first 2 weeks, copying all the notes I could while trying to get the hang of class once again. It had been a long time, and so much had happened. After 10 days, the deadline for paying school fees was approaching, and I was starting to get nervous. Something didn't seem right. My father knew my fees were due, but he hadn't mentioned anything, and fearing the worst, I couldn't bear to bring it up. The closest we got was a short conversation one afternoon in the fields. So how is school life? He asked. It's going okay, but I'm so behind. I think with time I'll catch up. Well, he said, just work hard. Despite him saying that, I couldn't help the sick feeling in my stomach. It was still there the morning Mr. Fury gathered everyone for morning assembly. Fees for this term are due Monday, he said, and those students who didn't pay last term's fees must also pay those without delay. Hey, wait a minute, I thought. Even though I dropped last term, I still have to pay those fees? Didn't seem fair. Together, the 2 terms equaled over 1,000 kwacha. Given what my family had just been through, 2,000 kwacha was an impossible amount. I knew my fate was sealed. But instead of going home to face it directly, I tried going to school for free. I snuck in. I had to calculate my movements carefully. On Mondays and Fridays, Mr. Fury held assembly inside the same classroom. There, he read aloud the names of students who were already paid their fees, telling them go to class straight away. The students who still seated had to show a receipt or else stand up and leave. Jeffrey had been humiliated this way 2 years before, so I was ready. On the first day of roll call, I arrived at school with Gilbert as usual, but as soon as everyone went inside for assembly, I ducked into the toilets to hide. I stayed low and scanned the courtyard through the tiny window. The minute Mr. Fury released everyone, I slipped into the crowd unnoticed. In class, I sat in the back of the room and kept my head down. I never asked questions for fear of being noticed. As long as I was silent, I thought I could listen and still learn. I was certain Mr. Tembo was wise to my tricks, remembering that I was booted the previous term for lack of fees, but if he knew, he never called me out. The whole experience was so stressful that every morning I awoke with the same awful stomach ache. Gilbert would meet me on the road and try to make me feel better. "Good morning, friend. I'm happy to see you're trying your luck again." "Yeah," I said. "Let's hope today isn't the end. Just stay quiet and don't say anything." I guess. Finally, after 2 weeks, I was busted. One morning, Mr. Tembo read aloud the names of debtors in class, and that's when I was caught. The second my name was called, I stood up and walked to the door. "Guys, I paid," I said, trying to be cool. "I just forgot my receipt. I'll get it and come right back." Once outside, I began to cry. Then I went home and told my father the news. "I've been expecting this," he said. "I just didn't know when." But instead of breaking my heart, my father went to Mr. Tembo and pleaded on my behalf. The tobacco would be ready in a few weeks, and after paying his creditors, my father was hoping against hope that there'd be enough left to sell and cover my school. "I'll have the money soon," he said. "Just please let him stay." Mr. Tembo spoke with some other teachers. They agreed to let me stay in school for 3 more weeks, long enough for my father to sell the tobacco. And for those 3 weeks were fantastic, like winning the jackpot. No more sneaking around, no more butterflies in my stomach. Now I could relax, learn, and participate in class. And when the teacher cracked a joke, I laughed at the top of my voice. "Oh, that's so funny," or "a good point. I didn't know that." The other students gave me strange looks. "These past weeks he's been posing as cool, quiet guy," one said, "but look at him now." At the end of 3 weeks, the tobacco was finally dried and ready, having turned the light chocolate brown in the sun. Once this happened, the creditors began turning up at our house looking to be paid. "I've come for my 50 kilos, one said. "Given our earlier agreement, do you have my 20 kilos? Asked another. By the time the last trader left pushing a bicycle laden with our tobacco, all that remained was a 60 kilogram bushel. My father loaded it into the pickup and drove it to Auction Holdings Limited in Lilongwe, where the buyers only agreed to take 50. After transport costs and government taxes, my father came home with around 2,000 kwacha. It was just enough to pay for my school. But then there'd be nothing left for the rest of the family. No money for my sister's shoes, no cooking oil, no soap or medicine if someone got sick. Once again, we were broke. My father tried to negotiate again with Mr. Tembo, but Mr. Fury forbade me to return. He said that his boss, the Minister of Education, was visiting various schools to ensure that students were paying their fees. "If we're caught, we could lose our jobs," said Mr. Tembo. I was sitting in the courtyard when my father returned with the news. "I've done my best," he said, "but the famine took everything." He kneeled down to face me. "Please understand me, son. Papani Kwa Mimbri. I'm very sorry. Your father tried." It was too difficult to look at him. "Chabuino," I said, "I understand. At least my daughter's a Malawian father can hope they'll marry a husband who can provide a home and food for them and continue their schooling. But with a boy, it was different. My education meant everything to my father. That night, he told my mother he'd failed his only son. "Today, I let down my entire family," he said. I couldn't blame my father for the famine or for our troubles. But for the next week, I still couldn't face him. Whenever I did, I saw the rest of my life. My greatest fear was coming true. I would end up just like him, another poor Malawian farmer digging me the soil, thin and dirty with hands as rough as timber and feet that knew no shoes. My life would forever be controlled by rain and the price of fertilizer and seeds, never by me. I would grow maize, and if I was lucky, maybe a little tobacco. And years when the crops were good and there was little extra to sell, perhaps I would buy a new set of clothes. But most of the time, there would be hardly enough to eat. My future had been chosen, and I was thinking about it scared me so badly. I wanted to be sick, but what could I do? Nothing, only accept. I had no time to feel sorry for myself. The maize was finally ready in the fields, and my father needed all of our help. As much as I'd waited for this time to come, I entered the harvest with a conflicted heart. Now that I knew I wasn't going to school, the maize rows appeared to be the bars of my own prison. I would enter their shadows, and the gates would be locked behind me. But at the time, my God, we were finally harvesting our food. And really, the harvest was the most fun time of the year, even better than Christmas. It was the time to celebrate all your hard work, all the mornings you woke up at 4 a.m. to dig ridges and pull weeds. But this season, it was even more significant. A time to remember the famine and the many nights of hunger and the good people across Malawi who didn't survive. Mostly I thought about Kwamba and the sadness I carried inside. And now, as we entered the maize rows ready to work, it was as if God was rewarding us for our sacrifice. We had a beautiful crop. The best in years, my father said. Just look at it. My mother stood beside him, staring across the fields with a smile I hadn't seen in months. We made it after all, she said. And for the next 2 weeks, we harvested all day with satisfied minds, and at night we slept like lions with bellies full of food. After collecting the cobs and hauling them home by ox cart, we spent 3 glorious weeks just sitting in the courtyard, plucking what we'd grown. We listened to the radio, sang songs, talked about the weather. Life had returned to normal. In storage, our grain sacks were full once again, so many they reached the ceiling and spilled out the doorway. Some soybeans from the garden were also ready, which meant that we could enjoy regular meals. Slowly, all the weight we'd lost during the famine started coming back. "Hey, Papa," my mother said to my father one night, "you are looking so skinny." My father smiled. "And you, Mama, I see you're finally coming back to us. But William, I was worried that strong wind might carry that boy away." We all laughed at it now because it was only during good times that we could talk truthfully about the bad. Once harvest was over, I was able to return to the scrapyard to collect pieces for my windmill. Walking through the tall grass, I'd see something interesting, pick it up, and think, "What on earth is this?" only to spot something even better a second later. One day, while poking through the weeds, I found that what looked like a 4-wheel drive differential, the gears that send power to the wheels and allow the vehicle to turn. I managed to pry off the casing with a screwdriver and discovered gobs of black engine grease. Every machine needs grease, I thought. I scooped it out into a plastic bag and stuck it in my pocket. That same day, I found a handful of cotter pins left inside the discarded hubcap. I collected bits of wire, plus some things I'd probably never use: brake pedals, a broken gear stick, and a crankshaft from a small engine. I took them home anyway. Early on, I realized that one of my biggest, most important pieces, the bicycle, had been sitting under my roof from the start. My father's broken bike had been leaning against the wall of the living room for over a year, collecting dust and dirty laundry. It had no handlebars, only one wheel, and its frame was rusted as anything in the scrapyard. I'd offered to repair it many times, but my father always gave me the same answer: "There's just no money." One day, I finally gathered the courage to ask him if I could use it for my windmill. I sat him down and explained the entire process, how the bike frame would make a perfect body and be sturdy enough to handle strong winds. I described how the wind and the blades would act as pedals and spin the wheel and the power generator. Electricity, I said, spreading my arms like a magician. Water. My father just shook his head. Son, please don't break my bike. I've already lost so many radios. Besides, one day we'll use that thing. Use it for what, I thought. To ride 5 miles to buy kerosene for the lanterns to make us all sick while you could have lights for free? Oh, it took so long to convince my father to give up that piece of junk. I must have begged for an hour. I have a plan, I persisted. Allow me to try. Just think, we could have lights, we could pump the water and have an extra harvest. We'd never go hungry again. He considered this for a while, then finally gave in. Okay, perhaps you're right, but please don't mess it up. I grabbed the bicycle and hurried into my room where I leaned it against the wall with my other materials. Standing back, I realized how my room had come to resemble the scrapyard itself. All from my windmill pieces, the bicycle, tractor fan, shock absorber, the bearings, sat in a picture-perfect row like a museum. The rest of the floor, however, was covered with random greasy bits that spilled under the bed and piled behind the door. The room smelled like the inside of a transmission. You never know what you might need, I reasoned. Of course, I forbade my sisters from even entering my room to sweep and mop. I was certain they didn't appreciate the value of a used muffler clamp or a water pump. Who knows what they might sweep into the dustbin. But Mama told us to clean, they yelled through the door. I'll tell you when it's time, I answered. I'm busy. When I wasn't in the scrapyard, I hung out at the library or sat in my hammock to read. At this point, my father felt so bad about my schooling that he no longer forced me to work in the fields. This made my sisters jealous. Why does William get to stay home and not us? Doris asked my father one day. Is it because he's a boy and we're girls? If he's staying home, so are we. William has a project, my father said, and if he's really wasting time, he'll be proven wrong eventually. You girls just worry about yourselves. With my father's blessing, I spent mornings and afternoons planning my windmill. I pored over chapters about electricity and explaining physics. I learned how it moves and behaves and how it is harnessed. I reviewed sections on home wiring, parallel circuits versus series circuits, and more stuff on AC and DC currents. Back at the library, I renewed the same 3 books over and over until one day Miss Sakello raised her eyebrows. William, are you still preparing for exams? What are you up to? Just building something, I said. You'll see. More and more, going to the scrapyard began to replace school in my mind. It was an environment where I learned something new each day. I'd see strange and foreign materials and try to imagine their use. One thing looked like an old compressor or something that was a landmine. I found real compressors and shook them to hear the pieces rattling inside. Then I would pry them open and investigate. My imagination was constantly at work. Sometimes I pretended to be a great mechanic, crawling on my back under the rusted cars with the tall grass clutching me in the arms. I'd shout up to the customer, "Start it up. Let's see how she sounds. Give it gas. Don't be shy. Whoa, 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 that's too much." If the engine didn't sound right, I gave it to them straight. Looks like you need an overhaul. I know, it's expensive, but that's life. I shouted to my other mechanics who were slacking as usual. "Fury, today you're doing oil changes." "Yes, boss." Another mechanic walked over and shook his head. "Problems again?" "Mr. Kamkwamba, boss, we can't fix this car. We've tried everything, but it still makes a noise. What do you think? Start it up." Yes. Injector pump. Thank you, sir. For sure." I climbed atop the tractor's pressed the ignition button with my foot, and pretended to drive. Out of my way, your man Kamkwamba must work. In my mind, I dug ridges in my fields, making up for all the days I swung a hoe in the sun. Each time I wished one of those tractors would actually fire up and move. If it did, I'd drag the whole scrapyard home. But no matter how much fun I had, my mood didn't last long. The students across the street at Kachokolo would see me banging away on various things. If I wasn't careful, they could even hear me talking to myself. A few times while carrying out my pieces, some kid in the playground cried, "Hey, look, it's William digging in the garbage again." The first time it happened, I walked over and tried to explain the windmill, but the kids just laughed. Even days when I tried sneaking past, someone would spot me through the open window and shout, "There goes that crazy guy off to smoke his chamba." Chamba is marijuana. Luckily, I have a few supporters, but Jeffrey had been hired by our uncle Muswali to work in the maize mill in Chipumba, and that meant that Gilbert was the only person I could trust. I finally decided that whenever someone shouted, "William, what are you doing in the garbage?" I just smile and say nothing. Of course, the students at Coacholo told their parents about the lunatic in the scrapyard, and soon my mother was getting an earful in the trading center. Now, when I came home with my pieces, she started to look at me and shook her head. One day, she barged into my room looking worried. "What's wrong with you?" she said. "Your friends don't behave this way. I mean, look at this room. It looks like a madman's room. Only madmen collect garbage." That night, she complained to my father. "How is he ever going to find a wife like this? How is he going to care for our family?" "Leave the boy alone," my father said. "Let's see what he has up his sleeve." Over the next few weeks, the treasures kept revealing themselves like the pieces of a magic puzzle. When I realized I needed more PVC, Gilbert allowed me to dig up the drain pipe from the floor in his bathhouse. He didn't bother asking his father, who wasn't happy the next morning. Once the pipe was clean and dry, I cut it down the middle with my bow saw. I melted it over the fire until it bubbled and curled, then rolled it off and pounded it flat. I then cut 4 blades, each measuring 4 feet in length. I wanted to go ahead and connect the blades to my tractor fan, but I had no nuts and bolts. I spent the next 2 weeks in the scrapyard turning over every machine with the piece of metal. But I only had a box and wrench, and it was too large for most of the bolts I found. Many were so rusted they stripped against the tool or refused to budge. I told this pathetic story to Gilbert one afternoon, and right away he offered to help. His father sometimes gave him money for working in the fields. That day, Gilbert walked to Mr. Dodge's shop with 50 kwacha and bought a sack full of screws, bolts, and nuts, all the perfect size for my windmill. I was so grateful. But I still had a problem. The metal pieces needed to be welded together to ensure they would hold. We had no welding machine at home, and to hire a welder cost more money. I was stalled again. Then one day in the trading center, I got lucky. I was playing bawa with some friends when a man pulled up in a dump truck. He was from Kasungu, and needed boys to help load some wood. "I'll pay you 200 kwacha for the job," he said. I ran over waving my arms. I'll do it. He motioned me into the truck bed, and along with 10 other guys, I spent all afternoon throwing logs under the sun, tired, sweaty, and with the biggest grin on my face. With 200 kwacha, I could pay a welder for the first phase of work, connecting the shock absorber shaft to the bicycle's bottom bracket. That way, it could spin the crankset and the chain would move the wheel. I also needed him to melt holes in the metal blades of the tractor fan so I could bolt the bigger PVC blades. Mr. Godston's shop was in the trading center under the grass-covered shelter. He used an electric welding box, ancient looking and made from wood, that plugged plugged into the wall in his home with a long, patched together cord. A crowd of people usually gathered around to watch him weld, myself included. The men would discuss a particular job while the boys played in the shower of sparks that shot from his gun. Even though I had money for the job, Godston laughed when I walked up carrying my pieces. You want me to weld a broken shock absorber to a bicycle with one wheel? He asked, mocking me. Others in the crowd joined in. Look at the madman. He's come with his garbage. We've been hearing about you. Hey, he's not a man, just a lazy boy who plays with toys and refuses to work. He's misala. That means crazy. My face grew hot. I was so tired of hearing those words. That's right, I said. I'm lazy, misala, whatever you want to call me, but I have a plan and I know what I'm doing. Soon, all of you will see. I then turned to Godston and gave him the dead eye. And to answer your question, mister, I said, you heard me right. Weld the shock absorber to the bicycle and make sure it's not crooked. When Godston was finished, I paid him my money and took the bicycle home. I returned it to its place in my room and started laughing. It really did look like a madman's creation. The shock absorber jutted from the crankset like a strange robotic arm, its joints fused with melted metal. Next to it, my blades leaned against the wall like giant insect wings, their white surfaces scorched and bubbled like a burned marshmallow. The tractor fan looked like a super Chinese throwing star, one that would slice through the darkness, leaving a trail of light. I couldn't wait to put them all together. But once again, I was missing something, and it was a big something. I needed a generator. But where in the world was I going to find such an expensive thing? I could wait and try to earn 500 kwacha and buy the dynamo in Dodge's shop, but that could take forever. The owner of the dry goods store had hired a permanent team of workers to unload his trucks, and the jobs loading wood came only so often. So I went back to the scrapyard. I spent the next 3 weeks sifting through the grass like a bomb-sniffing dog, turning over every piece of metal in hopes of uncovering a generator I may have missed, or at least an alternator. Hadn't I seen several of those? Well, it turned out that I wasn't the only one looking for such things. Some younger boys from the training center had also discovered the importance of electric motors, but instead of using them for science, they were using them, just stripping them out the wire to build toy trucks. I caught them one day as I entered the yard. I shouted, "Hey you," but they took off running. Maybe they'd heard the stories about the madman and feared for their lives. Anyway, when I got to where they'd been standing, I found a perfectly good motor stripped of its wires. It lay there dead in the grass like one of those poached elephants missing its tusks. I began to fear my windmill would never get built. Worse, over the next month, it seemed like every dynamo in central Malawi came out to taunt me. I saw them on bicycles everywhere, and most of the time they were broken, not even attached to a bulb. I'd think, God, what a waste. Give it to me and I'll show you how to use it. Others worked perfectly and shot fat beams of light down the dark roads at night. I never had the courage to flag down the owners. What would I say? Instead, I woke up each morning to a pile of metal in my room, then went to help my father in the fields. At night, the windmill pieces were easier to look at since everything disappeared in the dark. One Friday in July, Gilbert and I were walking home from the trading center, and I was feeling glum. "How's the windmill going?" he asked. "I have everything but still no generator," I said. "If I had that, I could build it tomorrow. I'm afraid this dream will never come true." "Oh, sorry, friend." Just then, we saw a guy pushing his bike. I didn't know him, but he was around our age, and as he passed, I looked down and noticed a familiar glitter by his tire. "And look," I said, "another dynamo." But this time I wasn't afraid. I ran over to the guy and asked him if I could see his bike. I bent down and gave the would spin, and when I did, the headlamp, an old car bulb, flickered on. Gilbert turned to him. "How much to buy the dynamo?" he asked. "No, Gilbert," I said. "I don't have any." "How much?" Gilbert said again. The guy refused at first, but finally gave in. No one was foolish enough to refuse money at this time. 200 kwacha, he said, with the bulb. "I still have some money from my father," Gilbert told him. "Let's use it to buy the dynamo. Let's finish the windmill." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 200 kwacha, 2 red paper notes. After some messing around to get the dynamo and the bulb off the bike, I was holding them in my hand. "Zikomo kwam mimbri," Gilbert, I said. "Thank you very much. You're the greatest friend I ever had." While Gilbert went home, I ran back to my room and placed the dynamo with the other materials, adding the last piece of the puzzle. The moment I laid it down, a magnificent gust of wind blew open my door and spun a cyclone into the room. It whipped up the windmill pieces in its arms and revealed the finished machine, its blades spinning wildly through a blur of red dust. Or maybe that was only a dream. Chapter 11. The Windmill Comes to Life. The following afternoon, I began assembling the machine. I dragged the bicycle tractor fan, blades, bolts, and dynamo outside and arranged them along the dirt. I'd chosen an area behind the kitchen, which doubled as my laboratory. The acacia tree provided plenty of shade against the mid-morning sun, and had also determined it was an ideal place to catch the eastern winds that rushed over the highlands from the lake. The first thing I wanted to do was connect the blades to the tractor fan. This called for a drill, so I went into the kitchen and stuck the cob-handled nail into the fire, and once it glowed hot, I bore a square pattern of 4 holes in the top of each plastic blade, plus 2 more in the center. This process of heating, melting, and reheating took nearly 3 hours. Next, I emptied a sack of nuts and bolts that Gilbert had given me onto the ground and started to fasten the first blade. That's when I realized I'd forgotten the washers. "Ah!" I shouted, frustrated with myself. Well, I definitely needed washers to secure the bolts, so I spent the next hour collecting bottle caps outside Ofesi Boozing Center. Once I had about 20, I hurried home, hammered them flat, and used a nail to poke a hole through their middles. Perfect. One by one, I drove bolts into each washer and tightened the nuts until all 4 blades were connected. Lastly, I wanted to make sure the blades were strong and wouldn't snap in the heavy wind. So I wired 3-foot bamboo reinforcements to each one, to where they acted like bones. "Okay now," I said, "let's have a look." I stood back to examine my work. From end to end, the wingspan of the blade stretched more than 8 feet, causing me to giggle with excitement. It was then that I noticed the compound was empty. My sisters were off running errands, and my father was attending a funeral in the nearby village. Besides my clinking and hammering, the only other noise was my mother humming to herself in the kitchen as she prepared a pot of beans for her supper. The privilege of privacy was mine, and I fell into a deep concentration. The next thing was to figure out how to connect everything to the bicycle, which wasn't going to be easy. I started by steadying the blades atop 4 tall bricks, like how a mechanic puts car on blocks, so I would have some room to work underneath. Then came the hard part. The bicycle was not only heavy, but cumbersome, especially with a giant shock absorber sticking out of the crankset. But I managed to lift it high enough to flip it over, then dropped the shock absorber into the center hole of the tractor fan. Quickly, I crouched down underneath the bricks and jammed the cotter pin through the other end, locking it tight. Finally, I attached the dynamo to the bike frame so its metal wheel hung against the side wall of the tire. I strung the chain, which was coated in warm black grease, over the crankset and made sure it held tight against the sprockets. By the time I finished the chain, the sun was setting behind the trees, and soon it would be too dark to work. I packed my tools away in my room, then moved the windmill against the wall of the kitchen and out of the way. I drew a bucket of water from the well and heated it for my bath, and after bathing, headed inside for supper. By then, my sister Rose had returned from the shops and saw me in the courtyard. "William, we haven't seen you all day," she said. "People in the trading center were asking about you." "Well, today your brother was busy," I said. "I told them you were playing with your metals to make power." "Something like that," I said, smiling. "Just wait. Soon you'll be in for a surprise, along with everyone else." I ate my supper like a real working man, saying nothing except to mutter a few well-orchestrated grunts. When I finished eating, I returned to my room, lay down on my bed, and was asleep in seconds. The following morning, I was awake at first light and ready to continue. My plan was to build a tall wooden tower for the windmill, but first I had to see if it even worked. For this, I need something temporary, so I found a thick piece of bamboo, more than 6 inches wide, and bore a hole in the top, then drove the other end into the dirt. I finished just in time to see Jeffrey ride up on his bicycle from Kamkwamba. It happened to be his day off, and he was coming to visit me. "Hey man, just in time," I said. "Is this the same project you were working on?" "Yeah, this is everything. I'm glad you're here, friend. Help me lift this thing." We locked the bicycle wheel and chain to keep from spinning, then carefully hoisted the machine onto the pole. I was out of rope, so once it felt sturdy, Jeffrey secured it using long straps from an inner tube. "Shall we?" he asked. "We shall." Jeffrey unlocked the tire so the blades could spin, except we didn't realize how quickly this would happen. In Malawi, the wind is never still. Within seconds, the blades were spinning so fast the chain snapped in half and the pole nearly tipped over. "Hold it," I shouted. Jeffrey and I barely managed to catch the machine before it crashed to the ground and broke apart. Once we had a grip, I twisted the pole and turned the blades out of the wind's direction. Then I spent the next 2 hours fixing the chain. The main reason for the test was to see if the dynamo produced enough current. I already knew it could power a small bicycle lamp, but what else? I went to my father's room and grabbed the international radio, which was forbidden to me given my history with my family's other electronics. When I returned, Jeffrey gave me a look. "Does your father know you're borrowing this?" he asked. I waved him off. "He's in the trading center. He'll never know it was gone." I jammed the dynamo's 2 wires into the radio's AC socket, and Jeffrey unlocked the windmill blades. They began to twirl, and the dynamo's metal wheels zipped against the spinning tire. For the slightest moment, I heard music. It worked, but a second later, black smoke started to pour out of the speakers. "Oh no," Jeffrey said, and ripped out the wires. The radio sat on the ground between us, sizzling like an egg. He spun around looking for my father, but I was too excited to care. "Did you see that power?" I screamed, jumping up and down. "Did you see it?" The radio blew up because the dynamo produced too many volts of electricity. Voltage, as I learned in my books, but how you measure electrical pressure. Think of it like water pressure coming out of a hose. The dynamo produced 12 volts when someone was pedaling like normal. This was enough for a radio or light bulb to manage. But when the wind gusted and spun the blades like mad, it caused the power surge that increased the voltage and fried my father's radio. I had to figure out how to reduce it. I flipped through explaining physics to where it showed a diagram of 2 separate light bulbs both being lit from a low 12-volt AC supply, exactly like my dynamo. Both bulbs were connected by long wires. One bulb burned very brightly, all because of something called a transformer, which boosted the voltage and made it stronger. But the second light bulb didn't have a transformer and glowed dim and yellow. That's because without a transformer, power was lost in the form of heat on its journey through the wires, something called dissipation. Mr. Jeffrey, I said, since energy can be lost in the wires when traveling long distances, perhaps we can try this on the dynamo. When I went into our big pile of radio parts and found an old motor. I cracked it open, removed the core, and unwound the long copper wire, and when wrapped it around a stick, creating my own kind of reverse transformer. I attached one end of the wire to the dynamo and the other end to my father's radio, which somehow managed to survive the power surge. Just like in the book, I was giving the electricity an extra long road to travel, hoping some of its voltage would get lost along the way. Okay, try it again, I said to Jeffrey. He unlocked the blades and the wheel and dynamo began to whir. This time there was only music. Our test was complete. The windmill sat on the bamboo pole for 2 days, hidden behind the house and out of sight. In the meantime, Jeffrey, Gilbert, and I had set to build a real tower. The three of us met in front of my house one morning with our panga machetes and walked into the blue gum forest. It was the same grove of trees where I'd sought refuge from the bubblegum curse and where I had accepted Shabani's magic, only to be beaten that day in Doha. And now it was here I went to build my ladder to science. I walked through the forest, looking carefully at each tree. Finally, we chose one that was about 18 feet high. We tore into the trunk with our blades, and after 10 minutes, the tree crashed to the ground. We used our pangas to prune the branches, then stripped the thin bark with our hands. By 3 o'clock, we'd felled and cleaned 2 additional trees and were hoisting them onto our shoulders, heading home. Just behind the kitchen, we set the poles down into the ground, each one the same distance from the other. Each pole was wrapped in jumbo bags to keep out the termites. We took smaller branches and nailed them sideways like rungs of a ladder, using the nails that Jeffrey had bought using his pay from the maize mills. By sundown, the tower was complete. It stood 15 feet high and was remarkably sturdy. However, from just a short distance away, its long and spindly legs gave the appearance of a wobbly giraffe. Get some sleep, gents, I said. Tomorrow we raise the machine. I could barely sleep that night, and I was out the door before the rooster even crowed. When I rounded the kitchen, Gilbert and Jeffrey were already standing by the tower. Look who decided to sleep late, Jeffrey said. I was so happy to see them. The windmill's frame weighed about 90 pounds, and the only way to hoist it up the tower was by rope and pulley. I didn't have any rope, so I had to borrow my mother's wire clothesline instead. I fastened one end to a crude handle that I'd made on the windmill from a piece of bamboo. I climbed the tower with the other end and looped it over the top rung and then dropped it down to Gilbert. From where I stood, I could see over the trees to where the patchwork of fields and forest joined the highlands. Okay, Gilbert, I yelled, bring it up. Slowly he began to pull. The bamboo handle lifted in the air, followed by the large gangly frame. Easy now. Jeffrey stood below me on the lower rung and guided the machine as it climbed. The three of us now pulled all of our strength. Come on, guys, I shouted. Let's see those muscles. I'm pulling as hard as I can, said Gilbert, straining under the weight. Don't let it slip, Jeffrey. With each pull, the windmill lurched sideways and banged its cumbersome blades against the wood. A couple of times they got stuck in the rungs, and Jeffrey had to knock them loose. Little by little, it made its way up the tower. After half an hour, we finally had it close to the top. When it came within reach, I grabbed the handle and screamed to Gilbert, tie it down. Gilbert looped the wire around the base pole and the windmill held. Jeffrey joined me at the top to secure the machine in place. The day before, we drilled the holes in the wooden poles. in my hot nail drill wasn't big enough, so I had to use flat bolts instead to a process that took hours. We'd also asked Mr. Godston to cut 2 matching holes in the bicycle's crossbar with his welding gun. Standing atop the tower, Jeffrey fished the nuts and bolts from his pocket when I held the frame and tried to align the holes. I could feel it slipping. "Hurry, this thing is heavy," I said. Jeffrey slid the bolts and tightened them with a wrench. Once everything was fastened, we looked at each other and smiled. The machine felt sturdy and very strong. While Jeffrey made his way down the tower, I remained atop my perch to take in the scenery. To the north, I could see the iron sheet of roofs in the training center and the rows of brown huts that sat behind the market. As I admired the view, I noticed something strange. A line of people had emerged and were heading in my direction. They must have seen the tower from the distance and were curious to have a look. "We have visitors," I said. Within minutes, a dozen people gathered at the base and gazed up at the machine. I recognized a few of them as traders and shopkeepers. One of them was Kalino. "What is this thing?" he asked. Since there's no word in Chichewa for windmill, I used the phrase magesti a mimfo, electric wind. I answered. "What does it do?" "Generates electricity from the wind." "That's impossible," Kalino said, laughing. He turned to get a reaction from the crowd. "It looks like a radio tower, and what kind of silly toy is that?" "Well," I said, "just stand back and watch." I climbed down from the tower and ran into my room for the final piece. That morning I'd found a thick reed and cut a section about 10 inches long and then wrapped it in long copper wire around the base of the headlamp bulb and strung it through, creating a light socket. Holding the socket and bulb, I climbed the tower and connected their wires to ones from the dynamo. As I worked, more and more people arrived and I could hear their chatter. "What do you suppose he's doing now?" asked a farmer named Banda. "This is the misala from the scrapyard my children were talking about," another man answered. "Think about his poor mother." Peering out, I saw my parents and sisters at the back of the crowd. Their eyes were wide and their jaws hung slightly open the way soccer fans look when clustered around a radio. Except this time it was me who had the ball and the only seconds left on the clock. My hands trembled from nerves, but I was confident. I prepared for this moment for months. "Let's see how crazy this boy really is," I heard someone shout. A steady wind whistled through the tower, mixing the smells of chain grease and melted plastic. Even though the wheel remained locked, the machine groaned against the breeze as if begging me to release it. I looked down at Gilbert and Jeffrey and nodded. "Here it goes," I thought. I jerked the wheel loose and the blades began to spin. The chain snapped tight against the crankset and the tire slowly turned. Everything happened in slow motion. "Come on," I said. "Don't embarrass me now." Just then a strong gust flung me forward. The tower began to rock so much that I wrapped my elbow around a rung just to hang on. Inches above my head, the blades began to buzz like a set of angry propellers. I clutched the bulb, waiting for my miracle. Then it came, a flicker, a flash, and then a burst of bright, magnificent light. My heart nearly exploded. "Look," someone shouted. "He made light." "It's true what he said." A group of children pushed through the crowd. "Look how it spins. Let me see." I threw my hands into the air and shouted with joy, laughing so hard I became dizzy. I held the bulb in triumph and addressed the unbelievers. "Electric wind," I shouted. "I told you I wasn't mad." One by one, the people began to cheer. They waved their hands and shouted, "Wachitawina, well done. You did it, William." "That's right," I said, "and now I'm going bigger. Just wait and see." The crowd shouted questions, then gathered around Gilbert and Jeffrey, grilling them for details. Those two guys couldn't stop grinning. I stayed on the tower listening to the blades and taking in the scene. I finally came down when the bulb started to burn my hand. My wire wasn't long enough to use the bulb anywhere but the windmill, so late in the afternoon I attached it to the top rung and left it. It was still so high from the I was still so high from the experience that I went to the trading center to burn off some energy and relish in the glory. Once I reached the market stalls, I looked back to the valley and saw the light still flickering through the heat waves. What is that thing? A man nearby clutching a sack of tomatoes. It's catching the wind just like a helicopter. The tomato seller was my mother's friend, Maggie. Well, the owner is right here. Why don't you ask him? Is it true? He said. How is that possible? I explained it to him the way I did everyone. I still don't understand, he said. I need to come and see for myself. For the next month, about 30 people arrived each day and to stare up at the light. How did you manage such a thing? They all asked. Hard work and lots of research, I replied, trying not to sound too smug. Many of them were traveling businessmen from other districts. To them, the windmill became a kind of roadside attraction while passing through Wimbay. Other people came from outer villages with chickens and maize strapped to their bicycles. Women balancing sacks of flour on their heads stopped and spoke with my mother. God has blessed you, one said. You have a child who can perform wonders. You'll never complain about kerosene again. The men approached my father. Your son made this? Yes. Where did he get such ideas? From books. They teach this in school? No, he did this on his own. That month, I helped clear the fields and prepare them for planting, working each day with joy in my heart. If I was in the fields near the windmill, I would pause in between swings of my hoe and just watch it spin. One night I was playing bow with Jeffrey and Gilbert near the barber shop when the light went out from a power cut. While everyone was cursing the dark, I snuck home and connected the bulb, then ran back. Oh, I hate those power cuts, a man complained, leaving the barber shop with only half of a haircut. What power cuts? I said with a smile. Have you chaps seen my house? Mr. Ipanga, the barber, leaned out his shop, still clutching his dead clippers. William, I think you take pride in your power cuts just so you can boast about your electric wind. Perhaps. The next month I started working on lighting my house using the windmill. To do this, I needed loads and loads of electrical wire. But, as usual, I had no money to buy any. Then, one afternoon, Gilbert and I were at Charity's house when I noticed long sections of copper insulated wire, the very thing I needed, being used as a clothesline. In fact, a whole spool of the stuff sat in the corner of the room. Hey man, I said to Charity, how can you play around with this wire when I need so much? Someone had given it to him as payment for Ganyu, he said, but since you're my cousin, I'll give you a discount. I was on my way to the trading center to look for a job when Gilbert pulled out 100 kwacha and gave it to Charity. Just like that, I had 30 meters of copper wire. I promise I'll pay you back, Gilbert, I said. Don't worry about it. Just put up the lights in your room. Once again, when all hope seemed lost, Gilbert came to the rescue. I ran toward home, clutching the heavy spool. As I flew down the trail and into the valley, I could see the windmill spinning in the distance. Now every time I saw it, my stomach did a flip. I unspooled the wire enough to measure the distance from the windmill to my room, then clipped it with my knife. Clutching one end, I climbed the tower. A windmill in motion was a hazardous work environment. The blades were spinning so fast I had to be careful or else I'd end up with a haircut. Also, the dynamo was producing real electricity. As I unhooked the bulb and attached the new wire, I was mindful not to cross them or I'd get a shock. To be extra safe, I wrapped a jumbo bag, which is plastic and doesn't conduct electricity around the junction where the wires tied together. The roof of my bedroom was made out of pallets of grass wrapped in plastic sheeting, each supported by several wooden beams. Standing on a ladder, I wrapped the wire 2 turns around the middle beam and one nearest my bed, then popped the hole through the pallet and lowered it down into my room. Inside, I made some final attachments, then pulled the bulb from my pocket. I may not be touching the wall to get light, I thought, thinking back to Gilbert's light switch, but this is close enough. I connected the reed and the bulb, and in an instant my room was illuminated. I ran to the door and slammed it closed, then marveled at the new electricity. For the first time ever, I had my own lighted space. That evening after supper, I lay in bed and just stared up at the bulb. It flickered yellow to the rhythm of the spinning blades outside, bright enough to read the library books I'd stacked up around me. I heard a knock at my door, and soon my father had crowded into my room. My family had crowded into my room. "Look, it's William staying up past dark," my father said. "Congratulations," said my mother. "We'd also like to have lights in our rooms. Think you can manage? Only if you're okay with having electricity generated by a madman." She laughed. You proved us all wrong in the end, but I'll admit I did worry." My sister Rose then asked, "What if the wind stops blowing?" It was an important question. "The light will go off," I said, "and I'll be stranded. That's why I have plans for getting some batteries." More specifically, I needed something like a car battery so I could store power for the times when the wind was calm. A car battery was also big enough to power the entire house. Once I had one, my family could finally toss out those kerosene lamps and live like modern people. And lights were just the first step. The next windmill would pump water out for our fields and give us some more food. Windmills would be our front line against hunger. That first night with light, I stayed awake reading, explaining physics, trying to prepare for my next step. I read for hours, long after everyone else was asleep, while the termites feasted on the roof and the clouds of red dust pushed under the door. As usual, a strong wind was blowing. All right, well, that's the end of chapter 11. And I know this is the last week of school, but since we're not finished with our book yet, I'm going to continue doing Tucked In Tuesday for a few more weeks until we finish our book. And then we'll take a break for summer from Tucked In Tuesday, and then we'll continue the Tucked In Tuesday again in the fall. But don't worry, we will finish our book. So next week, we'll pick up with chapter 12. All right, so I will say good night, sweet dreams, and sleep tight, and we'll see you next week.